Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jo Goddard. I'm the Director of Green and Good Consulting. We have a focus on ESG strategy, and we particularly support clients around the E, so the environmental aspects of ESG, and around the G as well. So I'm going to go straight into talking to you about really that sort of introduction around ESG and kind of what it is and why it's important and why people are taking note of this. I feel like its time has come. It's been something that I've been working on in its different forms in the past for probably 15, probably nearly 20 years, which makes me feel very old when I say that. And we've called it lots of different things, so lots of different words that you might have heard of. Sustainability, for example, was a bit of a buzzword a couple of years ago, quite a confusing term. And certainly when I started out, it was corporate social responsibility, CSR. But ESG is the term that is sort of quite prominent, most prominent, I'd say, today. And it actually comes from a kind of investor perspective. It's what investors used to use this term, that still do use, to look at the environmental, social and governance issues of a business when they're deciding on their investment decisions. And we've adopted it sort of within business and within civil society to sort of give this catch-all term. The reason that it's become more prominent really is because I think now we are much more aware of these issues, both social issues and environmental issues. Certainly probably even 3 years ago, so pre-pandemic, we probably weren't quite so in demand. We probably weren't quite talking about or really understood so much around environment and climate change and what it means and what it can do to business, but things have really shifted. And regulation or legislation has shifted as well. And certainly here in the UK and in the EU, we've had a legislation around environment and social issues for a while. So large listed organisations, so PLCs, have had to report on the E and the S, if you like, on quite a sort of simple format, sort of saying what they're doing to engage with community and perhaps what they were doing with their environmental policy if they had one. But that legislation really has come on leaps and bounds now. It's written into company law that we have to give a detailed explanation of our relationships, if you like, with community and our social issues, how we treat employees, for example, and think more broadly about other stakeholders. And on the environment side, the E side, things really have become quite detailed, particularly around greenhouse gas reporting, so GHG reporting, carbon emissions. You might understand that term. And certainly here in the UK, organisations, all organisations, so not just public listed companies, but all organisations, including charities, have to report GHG emissions. We have a piece of legislation called SECR, so the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Framework, that organisations of a certain size, so over 250 people, and there's some financial elements attached to that, have to report their carbon emissions. They have to talk about what they're doing to reduce them. They have to report historical emissions, for example. They have to report against a reporting framework that's understood and is not sort of just made up to fit their organisation. So these pieces of legislation really have put these things sort of a little bit on the agenda for senior people within the organisation, because they take time, they take effort, and they take understanding. And all of these things have made people think, well, hold on a second, if we're putting these into the public realm, we need to understand them, we need to get a hold of them, and we need to reduce them, because they're starting to affect our reputation. which is a very important thing. So this sort of reputational aspect, both internally and externally, is a really important thing for organisation to understand. If you are a large listed organisation, of course, there are lots of other reasons why this is something that people need to take note of and start to think about putting a strategy in place. So that's everything that we're focused on, making sure that this is strategic for the business and not just something that's done as an aside. So it's something that actually forms part of how the business works and sort of starts to influence your business model and also your governance, so how the business is run. And there are lots of what we call raters and rankers out there, which sort of organise companies into the sort of the good, the bads, and the sort of doing all right, could do betters sort of buckets. So you may well be familiar with terms like FTSE for Good or MSCI rankings or the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And these are looking at across broad areas of organisations and saying, you know what, these people are pretty good around the environment, but not so good on the social elements, and actually the governance structure is not quite what we mean. And that's really something that people take note of. Again, at those senior levels, it's important for them to get good scores, of course, and protect their reputation. But more and more, it's really important for employees to think, well, hold on a second, yeah, I do want to work for a good organisation, a good company. And it is very nice when we get a Great Places to Work badge, or we know that we're doing particularly good on FTSE for Good, for example. And what we do know is one of these really key drivers for employees, because they say at interviews, especially younger people now, will say, actually, we want to work for an organisation who has a good, sound understanding of environmental issues, treats their people well, and does good things for the community. And actually those statistics are quite staggering. You know, we've heard stats of around 84% of recent graduates would much rather work for an organisation who has good ESG ratings and rankings and communications, very, very important, rather than just get any old job. And that's why there's been a bit of a race to be very, very good at these things. But it has to be done authentically. And that is key. People can see through a bad ESG strategy. And of course, you will have heard this term, greenwashing. And unfortunately now, that's sort of showing it's the flip side also of green hushing. So people are very frightened of saying the wrong thing. Organisations have, of course, now been penalised and been fined. You know, we've had these stories of HSBC and Deutsche Bank and others really getting very heavily fined for saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing around the environment. So now organisations are sort of saying, we're not going to say anything at all about what we're doing around ESG, but for fear of getting it wrong. So this term green hushing is yet another new term to get our heads around. But actually what we think can prevent that is having a very good sound strategy with targets and might unmute myself and see if people can still hear me. Hopefully that's okay. So I was talking about green hushing and why, therefore, strategies are very, very important to have good targets and goals. I just wanted to give you a little example around governance. Governance is quite a tricky thing to get your head around, particularly when you're thinking about strategies. By governance, we broadly mean how the business is managed, making sure that you have effective leaders in place, making sure that pay structures are appropriate and linked to strategy. But it can also mean the general running of organisations and things like business ethics and how people are treated. And actually something that's come up in the news and is quite a hot topic at the moment, and is particularly sending some sort of bells ringing in the ESG space, And that is this issue around Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, for people who know, which of course is in the news at the moment in the US and the UK particularly. And some mud has been thrown really in the direction of ESG, because Silicon Valley Bank actually had a pretty good E&S strategy. They very focused on diversity and inclusion, for example. That was an enormous thing, but they forgot a little bit about the G. And they didn't have a risk officer, for example, a chief risk officer for 8 months. And this has been the thing that people have been pointing at and saying, that's why things have gone so terribly wrong, because they didn't focus on the G enough. They were sort of looking a little bit too far in the other direction and not so much focusing on risk, which of course, if you're a bank, is enormously important. So that's really just saying this G bit, which is a little bit outside our comfort zone if you're doing E&S from a sort of CSR point of view. And actually this is some of the reason why this term is important, because it's very much about mainstream business. And G is very important to get that right. You need an effective governance of any company in order to make sure that everything runs effectively. I'm going to stop there. I'm not entirely sure what we're doing with timing, but hopefully I haven't run on too much. And I'm going to hand over to Charlotte Turner, who's going to talk to you about something very similar, but with a different term, and sort of bring to life the differences within that. Charlotte, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jo. Just to introduce myself, and there are some similarities with what I'm going to talk about. My name is Charlotte Turner. I work for an organisation called Bena Research, which focuses on social value and social impact assessment. I've been knocking around this world for 3 decades or so. Initially, I'm a researcher by trade. Initially at Ipsos Mori, I was responsible for research on corporate responsibility, and then research director at Business in the Community for another few years. And having set up Bena Research back in 2012, we've really seen the shift of from the S being part of corporate social responsibility, really about social value now, and how social value is not only a term that companies are more used to, but has increasing expectations for companies in terms of both measuring and reporting the value that they have. I often see webinars and discussions about the S of ESG, and I'd take a much broader view of in terms of definition of social value, really moving to it being an understanding of an organization's value beyond purely financial performance, and to really understand the impact that business has on society, and how it creates social value is really important to then not only how it reports it, but how it can increase that social value and the social impact that it has. In fact, the UK government definition of social value now, and increasingly internationally, is that much broader in terms of social value incorporating the way an organisations develop skills, provides jobs, helps people with hurdles to work, enhances skills through the supply chain, their ethical procurement practices throughout the supply chain, as well as all the environmental aspects as well, and all that place-based and how place-based community activities and how that company responds to social value. So I would take a much broader view, I suppose, from a social value perspective as a different terminology. And this is where it does get quite complicated in this world. I think Jo's talked around why it's important, and I think just to reiterate a couple of things, I totally agree, the time has absolutely come. And while it's been called different things, a few things have happened in the last few years that have accelerated that. I think the business case for responsible business has been well made about how it's important for engaging stakeholders, employees. It's good for business, it's good for society, it's good for environment. The investor lens of ESG and the importance that they have placed on ESG, and therefore how it has moved into the boardroom discussions, is a really important element in the last few years. And while we may all have discussions about ESG and what that means and how that's different from sustainability, what it has done is it's moved the discussion absolutely into the boardroom of how a company responds to the environmental and social challenges and the governance structures it puts around that too. And so that, I think, is absolutely crucial, as well as Jo said, the employee angle. We know it's important for employees. We know that employees coming into the market now, absolutely not just nice to have, they absolutely expect their employer to have a really clear organizational purpose and report and measure and talk about how they are achieving that purpose. Harvard Business Review wrote very recently, actually, although this has been discussed for a number of years, they moved it on slightly, talking about helping employees connect with what they do, with what they care about, it is really important. So it's not just that it's a good thing for the business to do, but it's connecting what the business does to what that employee cares about. Living those values, I think, is absolutely crucial here. And the other two key things I think has moved. One, civil society has moved on quite fast on this. In terms of social impact assessment, look to the charity sector, who are doing a fantastic amount of really understanding, developing theory of changes and understanding how they create value and how they report against it. And in some ways, business is playing a little bit of a catch up on that, but it's moving fast. And particularly with the government incentive on this, that in 2012, the Social Value Act stated that any public procurement had to consider social value. In 2021, that changed to have a 10% weighting in the criteria that they choose in any public procurement. That's that £321 billion in the UK alone. So that's an absolutely crucial accelerator for social value. The extent to which companies have to, if they want to sell goods and services to government, and it's not just the UK doing this, then they have to explain how they create social value, measure it, report on that on a regular basis. And obviously that includes all the environmental angles as well. So that then drives through the supply chain. And we're really seeing the effect of that, of companies having to really bring up and how they talk about social value and what that means for the organization. But going back a few years, I don't know if you've seen it, I'd highly recommend it, and a report that Deloitte did called Driving Corporate Growth Through Social Impact. They talk about 4 corporate archetypes, and I think it's really important to go back to that. They talk about the shareholder maximizer, which is, I suppose, a traditional business that might promote social causes. And then the corporate contributor, which is driven by those external factors, thinking, okay, so what do we need to do to satisfy those external stakeholders? And then there's the impact integrator, which is really beginning to think about social value and how that is integrated across the organization, and beginning to explore market opportunities and developing social and environmental strategies alongside corporate strategies, really integrating that. And I think the majority of companies, certainly that we see, are moving from that kind of corporate contributor to the impact integrator. But they have one other category, which is the social innovator. And those are the organizations that are really have social impact integral to their strategy. And they're the organizations that are really able to create new socially conscious products, services, and expanding their markets. And I think that's a really exciting area that a number are moving into. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. The next question that obviously comes after that is the how. How do you do it? How do you create report on social value? And we work with a lot of different organizations that have lots of different approaches. And when I'm a social impact leader at Cranfield Business School, and when I teach MSCs and MBAs about social value, we always go back to what the organizational purpose is and look at what that then means to what value could be created. And I think that's a really important starting point. There are a number of frameworks for measuring social value, but the organizations really, in my view, that make it work are those that really think about how they create value through their products, their processes, their people, their procurement, and talk about that very holistically. I would also urge you to think about and do with students, think about the Social Value UK principles, which are quite broad, and Social Value International for those outside the UK. Think the principles of social value measurement and reporting are absolutely crucial here, which is about transparency. Everybody does it differently. That's fine. There are lots of different frameworks. Be transparent, be responsive, really involve stakeholders, and really crucially only include what's material. I have so many examples of clients who've said, oh, we do all these things, let's measure everything. And actually just really sitting back and thinking about it independently and thinking about only measuring what is material and not overclaiming is absolutely crucial. So I would always start there, start with organizational purpose and look across the organization to really think how they can create. So they then don't just rely on an investor's ESG questionnaire or employees' requests, that they have a really strong understanding, and as Jo said, build their own strategy around how they define ESG, how they define creating social value. And if it does understand how it creates social value, then it is better able to report and measure against that. Just to finish off a few examples, just to bring it to life. I mentioned charities. I think a lot of we work with a lot of charities, funders, as well as corporates. And I think increasingly funders expect, and charities are delivering on, having a clear understanding through a theory of change process of how they create social value and how they can report against it. And I think that's quite a useful process. And one that can be brought into the commercial sector too, and one which we took into City and Guilds when we were looking at creating how you create social value within City and Guilds. Just as an organisation itself, its overall organisational purpose is to develop skills for growth for people, organisations and economies. And therefore, the impact framework then becomes much more about how do you create value for people, in both employees and learners in this case? How do you create value for the organizations you work for, and what does that mean for social value creation, with lifelong learning and skills development in wider society? I also often talk about Morgan Sindall as a construction company, very different organization. Its organizational purpose is creating inspiring places that enhance communities where we can all live, learn, work, play, care and protect. But if you get back to the inspiring places and enhancing communities, their social value strategy is built on those two. How do you create inspiring places, built environment, rethinking about sustainability in the built environment, but also how you create socially cohesive communities in which they operate. And they were one of the first companies to create social value targets based on the financial proxies, HM Treasury Green Book financial proxies of social value, and have that it targets publicly declared targets of social value for the next few years. One other example is a client we're working with in the hospitality sector. We all know that the challenge the hospitality sector, one of the challenges the hospitality sector faces, is the huge vacancies that they have. Across the UK at the moment, we have 1.1 million vacancies across the UK as a whole, and we have 1.3 million people economically inactive. How can they as an organisation, they set back and said, how can they as an organisation bridge between the two? How can they help people with hurdles to work into work while solving the business challenge that they have about being able to keep restaurants open with enough staff? And therefore their development of their social value strategy is absolutely about helping people with barriers into work and thinking differently about the employment contracts they have and where they recruit and build value from. All of which I think is a very useful way to begin to think about the wider values perspective. One more recommendation, if you haven't read it, Mark Carney, ex-governor of the Bank of England, read a brilliant book called Values. And that's really kind of questioning, moving it from this is a nice to have on the edge of your business. Corporate responsibility happens 2 doors down on your left. It doesn't. It happens across the organization, to which all employees play a part. And he really talks about how markets need to change as a result of that. I know that's a really big canter through, and apologies for that. But hopefully that gives you quite a lot of insight into social value. I'll hand on to Julia.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, I'm Julia, and I've been at City and Guilds for 8 years now, and I am looking after ESG at City and Guilds. We call it also responsible business. I'm going to talk to you today about how to organize teams and training them for ESG progress or action. At City and Guilds, we've always been focused on creating positive impact on society through skills. And we're really clear on our role in creating a just, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable world. It's our purpose to help people, organizations, and economies to grow. So in everything that we do, we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to learn, develop, and raise aspirations for others. In the context of ESG for City and Guilds, as climate change has become increasingly important in our daily lives, the expectations of our customers or employees, as Joe and Charlotte said, and investors as well have changed. Then it's really clear now that businesses have to be a force for good. And ESG gives us a framework to do exactly that, to become that force for good. So a year ago, and working with Joe, we've defined our approach to ESG. And Jen, if you could just move on the slide, please. Thank you very much. So that approach is built around 3 pillars of activity where we can have the most significant impact. So that's planet, people, and product. And this is like called the triple bottom line. So it's a different way to do business. We are, as you can see, acting to reduce our impact on the environment and also sharpening our focus on equity and social mobility through skills that are relevant for a just and inclusive economic transition. In terms of organizing, we've created 3 working groups to deliver this work, and these are composed of operational leads, but also subject matter experts. These groups are sponsored by executive members, members of the senior executive team. So that really does help raise the profile of ESG in the business, but also set the pace for progress. So I'd recommend that. But we also at the beginning of the journey, and I wanted of the ESG journey, our ESG journey, I really wanted to share with you what we found in terms of identifying learning needs and the role that learning can play in helping deliver progress. Next slide, please. Sorry, Jen, would you mind?
Sorry, I am. My computer has decided to freeze on me, Julia. 1 second, sorry.
No worries. In a moment, you'll see a list of topics, of learning topics, and some of.
Bear with me, sorry, Julia.
That's all right.
Yeah.
That's fine, but so these learning topics you'll be really familiar with because they're really around compliance, and some of these are also really specific to the work that we do at City and Guilds. But what I wanted to say is what I wanted to highlight, why is sharing ESG knowledge important? It's really key to defining a common understanding of ESG issues, and it's also key to help colleagues understand what they can do differently. It's really important that colleagues help us report on ESG progress. So it's important to kind of guide our colleagues on how to measure the progress and the success of their work and the impact that we have eventually. And finally, it's great. Learning is great for engagement, as colleagues can keep the why in mind, like why are they doing this work, seeing the impact of their work rather than focusing on the what they're doing. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to look at a few case studies of City and Guilds case studies. So carbon literacy has been something that has a significant impact and success at City and Guilds. We've developed a course with the Carbon Literacy Project that is tailored to our organization and looks at climate science and the impacts of climate change on people, local areas, region, businesses, and the economy and society. Carbon literacy also looks at carbon impacts of everyday activities and how to reduce them. And it also looks at how to talk effectively about climate change. So this really is an important piece for us at City and Guilds because that helps us develop that collective knowledge and that collective action that we need to reduce our carbon footprint and impact the environment as positively as we can. But also the carbon literacy has a ripple effect because that knowledge can be taken by colleagues into their homes and communities and start to affect more social change, actually. Next slide, please. We also have training on social impact. So as you know, and as Charlotte said, working with Charlotte on measuring our social impact. And that's something that we do well. But that's because we've also worked hard to help colleagues understand how we're measuring the difference that we make and have articulated what difference every colleague is making on people, organization, and wider society. So this training, it's an e-learning. We've got two actually e-learning modules, and it also has examples to bring to life these, the role that every colleague plays. We have the diversity, equity, and inclusion training as well, which is really tailored to what we do to our organization and built around our lived experience program and also employee engagement surveys. Next slide, please. And in terms of board education, so this is a fair amount of education has happened. Joe will know that around, and Charlotte as well, actually. Around when we've worked on measuring our carbon footprint and designing our net zero strategy. So there was a lot to learn around carbon emissions, the risks and benefits of reducing our carbon footprint, like helping them understand things like the saving that the organization would make by operating more efficiently in terms of energy efficiency and things like that. Updating the board on ESG trends is also super important, from like ethical investment issues or the importance of supply chain management and how that should become a central activity in terms of ESG. And finally, the regulatory and reporting landscape needs to be understood by the board, not only in terms of reputation or compliance, but really as a strategic tool to identifying sustainability gaps and also ESG risks, as we've highlighted, but also the opportunities that ESG provides. Next and final slide, please. And this one is really about your own learning and my experience of, not neglecting your foundational knowledge to be able to influence colleagues and influence change. So I would recommend, that's what I've done, courses on broad environmental awareness, measuring your carbon footprint, but also, having a look at different reporting frameworks that are around, and carbon literacy, of course, and how to deliver carbon literacy to your staff. That's it from me. Sorry, I spoke very quickly. Hope that was helpful. I don't know, do we do questions, Jen, or are we moving on straight away into
No, thank you for that. I think we've laid the foundation really nicely now to go into breakouts. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop recording now, because obviously we're inviting you all into to some breakouts to kind of discuss this with you and get your insights and the like. So if I can ask